You are standing beneath the limestone columns of Karnak, watching workers systematically chisel away cartouches that once proclaimed the divine kingship of a pharaoh, whose name was forbidden to speak. The desert air shimmers with heat as hammers ring against ancient stone, each blow obliterating another trace of the revolution that nearly transformed Egyptian civilization forever. Fragments of carved limestone litter the temple floor, bearing partial hieroglyphs of a name that scribes were ordered to strike from every monument, every papyrus, every memory. The workers pause only to wipe sweat from their brows before continuing their methodical destruction, erasing evidence of the 18 years when Egypt worshipped not the sun, but the silver disk of the moon. This is the story of Khaemwaset III, the pharaoh who dared to proclaim that everything his people believed about the divine order was fundamentally wrong. Born in 1360 to BC as Prince Khaemwaset to Pharaoh Amenhotep IV and Queen Tai, the future revolutionary entered a world where cosmic order had remained unchanged for over 3 millennia. The great temples of Karnak stretched along the Nile like man-made mountains, their pylons carved with scenes of pharaohs making offerings to Amun-Ra, the king of gods whose dominion over Egypt seemed as eternal as the river itself. The priesthood of Amun controlled vast estates encompassing nearly 1/3 of all arable land in the kingdom, wielding economic and spiritual power that rivaled the pharaoh's own authority. Into this ancient world stepped a young prince whose destiny would challenge every assumption about divine kingship, religious truth, and the very nature of cosmic reality. The prince's education followed patterns established over countless generations of royal children. Tutors taught him to read and write hieroglyphs in their most complex forms, to calculate astronomical observations that would determine festival dates, and to understand the intricate religious ceremonies that maintained Egypt's relationship with the divine realm. But somewhere within this traditional curriculum, seeds of revolution were planted. Perhaps it was during night vigils in the temple observatories where he learned to track celestial movements that young Khaemwaset I became fascinated with Khonsu, the moon god who traveled across the night sky in his silver boat. Unlike Ra, whose daily journey was predictable and constant, Khonsu displayed mysterious cycles of growth and decline, death and rebirth, that seemed to mirror the deeper rhythms of existence itself. Contemporary records describe the prince as intellectually precocious but physically distinctive, tall and lean with an elongated skull that would later be exaggerated in royal portraiture to almost supernatural proportions. Court physicians noted unusual characteristics in his bone structure that may have indicated a genetic condition affecting his endocrine system, possibly explaining both his distinctive appearance and his later obsessive behaviors. The royal family's long history of strategic marriages between close relatives had concentrated bloodlines that carried not only divine authority, but also hereditary predispositions to mental and physical abnormalities that would manifest dramatically in subsequent generations. At age 16, Prince Khaemwaset married his half-sister Tai, a union that followed standard royal protocol designed to maintain the purity of divine blood, while preventing competing noble families from gaining access to the throne through marriage alliances. Queen Tai was renowned for her intelligence and political acumen, serving not merely as royal consort, but as genuine partner in governing the most powerful empire of the ancient world. Their early years of marriage appeared conventional by royal standards, marked by the birth of several daughters and the prince's gradual assumption of increasing responsibilities in temple administration and diplomatic affairs. The transformation began subtly during his 22nd year, when astronomical observations revealed a rare lunar eclipse that coincided with the flooding of the Nile, an event that traditional Egyptian theology struggled to interpret within existing mythological frameworks. Standing on the temple roof at Karnak, watching the moon disappear into shadow before emerging reborn in silver radiance, something fundamental shifted. Within the young prince's understanding of cosmic order, the eclipse seemed to reveal that the moon possessed powers of death and resurrection that surpassed even the sun's daily journey through the underworld, suggesting that Egyptian theology had misunderstood which celestial body truly governed the cycles of life, death, and rebirth that defined existence itself. When his father died in 1344 BC, the 28-year-old prince ascended to the throne as Khaemwaset III, inheriting an empire that stretched from Nubia to the Euphrates, an administrative system refined over centuries, and a priesthood whose authority had never been successfully challenged by any pharaoh. His coronation followed ancient protocols unchanged since the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, with elaborate ceremonies in which he received the double crown, the crook and flail, and the divine breath that transformed mortal man into living God. But even during these traditional rituals, observers noted unusual elements that hinted at future changes. The new pharaoh ordered that certain ceremonies be conducted at night under moonlight, rather than during daylight hours, a subtle alteration that confused priests, but was too minor to provoke open resistance. The first 3 years of his reign appeared conventional, marked by successful military campaigns in Nubia that secured Egypt's southern borders, diplomatic exchanges with Mesopotamian kingdoms that maintained international stability, and construction projects at traditional temple sites that satisfied the conservative priesthood. Queen Tai bore him additional daughters during this period while serving as his closest advisor on matters of state, her intelligence and political instincts helping navigate the complex relationships between pharaoh, priesthood, nobility, and common people that maintained social order throughout the kingdom. But beneath this surface normalcy, the new pharaoh was quietly studying astronomical texts, consulting with foreign scholars, and developing theological interpretations that would soon shake Egyptian civilization to its foundations. The revelation came during his 4th year as pharaoh, when a series of dreams, possibly induced by hashish or other consciousness-altering substances known to Egyptian priests, convinced Khaemwaset that Khonsu had chosen him to restore true religious understanding to Egypt. Unlike the violent solar theology that emphasized Pharaoh's role as warrior king conquering enemies of cosmic order, lunar theology revealed gentler truths about cycles of renewal, feminine wisdom, and the healing powers of silver light that could cure both physical ailments and spiritual corruption. The moon's monthly death and resurrection demonstrated divine principles that the sun's unchanging daily journey could not provide, offering hope for individual transformation and collective renewal that solar worship had never achieved. High Priest Amenemheb of Karnak initially attempted to accommodate these theological innovations by suggesting that Khonsu could be incorporated into existing religious structures as another manifestation of Amun-Ra's divine power, a diplomatic solution that might have prevented the crisis that followed. But Khaemwaset's revolutionary vision could not be contained within traditional frameworks. He began proclaiming that everything Egyptian civilization believed about the divine order was fundamentally mistaken, that 3 millennia of religious development had obscured rather than revealed cosmic truth, and that only complete transformation of Egyptian spiritual life could restore the kingdom to divine favor. The decision to abandon Thebes and construct a new capital dedicated exclusively to lunar worship represented the point of no return in Khaemwaset's revolution. The site he selected lay 200 kilometers north of Thebes on the east bank of the Nile, in a region where limestone cliffs formed a natural amphitheater that would frame the rising moon. Each night like a cosmic theater, he named this city Khonsu-Hotep, meaning Khonsu is satisfied, and decreed that it would become the religious and administrative center of a reformed Egyptian civilization, purified of solar corruption and dedicated to the eternal wisdom of lunar cycles. Construction began in his 6th regnal year using revolutionary building techniques that allowed rapid assembly of standardized stone blocks, enabling the creation of a complete urban center within 5 years. Unlike traditional Egyptian temples that were dark, mysterious structures accessible only to priests, the Great Temple of Khonsu was designed as an open-air complex where moonlight could illuminate every chamber, every offering table, every sacred space where worshippers gathered to receive the healing power of silver radiance. The temple's orientation followed lunar rather than solar alignments, with the main sanctuary positioned to frame the full moon as it reached zenith, creating dramatic, nocturnal ceremonies that replaced the traditional dawn rituals of solar worship. The new capital attracted artisans, scholars, and craftsmen whose work produced artistic innovations as revolutionary as the religious transformation they served. Sculpture abandoned the rigid formalism of traditional Egyptian art in favor of fluid, organic forms that emphasized cyclical change rather than eternal stability. Paintings depicted nocturnal scenes illuminated by moonlight, showing the royal family receiving life-giving rays from Khonsu's silver disk, while surrounded by the feminine deities. Associated with lunar wisdom, architecture incorporated unprecedented amounts of open space and natural light, creating environments that celebrated the cycles of growth, decay, and renewal that lunar theology recognized as fundamental to existence itself. Queen Tai initially supported her husband's religious innovations, serving as high priestess of the reformed cult while maintaining diplomatic relationships with traditional power centers that might otherwise have mobilized immediate resistance to the revolution. Her political skills proved crucial during the early years at Khaemwaset when the new regime needed time to consolidate power, while avoiding civil war with the displaced Amun priesthood. But the psychological pressures of leading a revolutionary movement while managing a vast empire began taking their toll on both Pharaoh and Queen, creating stress within their marriage that would have tragic consequences for their daughters and the kingdom they ruled. By his 10th regnal year, Khaemwaset had become convinced that divine bloodlines needed to be concentrated through marriages between the closest possible relatives to ensure that future rulers would possess the spiritual purity necessary to maintain the lunar revolution. The theological justification drew upon astronomical observations, suggesting that the moon's power was strongest when it appeared to embrace itself, a cosmic principle that could be mirrored on Earth through marriages between fathers and daughters that would create unprecedented concentrations of divine authority. This interpretation, possibly influenced by foreign religious traditions or by mental deterioration caused by inbreeding-related genetic disorders, led to decisions that shocked even the reformed priesthood that had followed him to Khaemwaset. When Queen Tai died mysteriously during the 11th year of his reign, possibly from illness, possibly from suicide as court whispers suggested, Khaemwaset elevated his eldest daughter Nefertari to the position of principal queen. Contemporary records provide no insight into the psychological impact of this transformation on a young woman who had grown up viewing her father as divine protector and moral guide, only to find herself expected to become his conjugal partner. In service to theological abstractions she may not have understood, the royal iconography from this period shows Nefertari wearing queenly regalia, while standing beside her father-husband in poses that echo earlier depictions of his marriage to her mother, creating visual continuities that mask the revolutionary nature of the domestic arrangements now governing the royal household. Nefertari's elevation to queenship marked the beginning of a systematic program of father-daughter marriages, designed to preserve the genetic and spiritual purity that Khaemwaset believed necessary for maintaining his religious revolution. When she proved unable to produce the male heir required for dynastic continuity, he married his second daughter Ankhesenamun while keeping Nefertari as senior queen, creating unprecedented complications in royal protocol that confused both courtiers and foreign diplomats. The diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals increasing bewilderment among Egypt's international partners who struggled to understand which queen held actual authority and whether traditional marriage alliances remained viable with a pharaoh who seemed to be retreating into domestic arrangements that defied conventional understanding. The marriage to his third daughter Meritneith represented the most extreme phase of Khaemwaset's family policies, occurring when the youngest princess was barely 14 years old and coinciding with a period of increasing military pressures on Egypt's borders. Hittite forces had begun probing Egyptian defenses in Syria, while Nubian tribes tested the southern frontier, taking advantage of a pharaoh whose attention seemed focused entirely on religious experimentation and domestic complications rather than the practical requirements of imperial defense. General Ramesses, who commanded Egypt's military forces, sent increasingly desperate reports about equipment shortages, personnel problems, and morale issues among troops who no longer understood what they were fighting to defend. The psychological Dynamics within the royal household became increasingly complex as Khaemwaset's daughter wives navigated relationships that required them to be simultaneously children and adults, sisters and rivals, daughters and mothers to potential heirs whose parentage would determine the future of both dynasty and kingdom. Nefertari appears to have assumed a maternal role toward her younger sister wives, while maintaining her position as senior queen, suggesting either remarkable psychological resilience or complete dissociation from the emotional realities of her situation. Archaeological evidence from Khansehotep indicates that all three daughter queens maintained separate households within the royal precinct, possibly indicating that their marriages remained largely ceremonial rather than involving regular conjugal relationships. The economic implications of the lunar revolution proved as disruptive as its social consequences, undermining trade relationships that depended on religious compatibility, while creating massive expenses for maintaining to complete administrative systems as traditional temples continued operating alongside the reformed institutions. The priesthood of Amun, though officially displaced from their dominant position, retained control over vast estates and substantial popular support among common people, who found lunar theology abstract and inaccessible compared to traditional religious practices that offered concrete benefits and familiar comfort. Tax revenues declined as provincial governors struggled to implement religious reforms that contradicted local traditions, while tribute from vassal states diminished as Egypt's military weakness became apparent to neighboring powers. Vizier Artahatep, who had served as chief administrator throughout the transition to Khansehotep, documented the kingdom's deteriorating condition in reports that reveal the human cost of revolutionary idealism. Food shortages developed in several provinces as agricultural rituals dedicated to traditional fertility deities were replaced with lunar ceremonies that common people believed ineffective for ensuring successful harvests. Urban centers experienced population decline as craftsmen and merchants emigrated to kingdoms where traditional trade relationships remained stable. The military faced recruitment problems as potential soldiers questioned whether service to a pharaoh who married his own daughters could bring divine protection in battle or honor in death. The diplomatic isolation became complete during Khaemwaset's 15th regnal year, when the Hittite king sent a letter explicitly mocking Egyptian royal customs, while announcing territorial claims that previous pharaohs would have answered with immediate military intervention. The Babylonian ruler, traditionally Egypt's closest ally in Mesopotamian politics, ceased sending diplomatic gifts while redirecting trade relationships toward other Mediterranean powers. Even the Nubian kingdoms that had paid tribute to Egypt for centuries began asserting independence, correctly calculating that a pharaoh obsessed with domestic religious experimentation lacked the will or capacity for military campaigns necessary to maintain imperial authority. The final years of Khaemwaset's reign were marked by increasing isolation within his lunar paradise, as the world beyond Khansehotep descended into chaos that traditional Egyptian statecraft might have prevented or contained. Archaeological evidence suggests that the city's population peaked at approximately 60,000 inhabitants during the 13th regnal year before beginning a gradual decline as courtiers, artisans, and administrative personnel quietly relocated to Memphis or other cities where economic opportunities remained viable. The Great Temple of Khonsu continued hosting elaborate nocturnal ceremonies, but attendance diminished as people questioned whether lunar rituals could address the practical problems facing Egyptian civilization. Khaemwaset died in his 18th regnal year, possibly from complications related to genetic disorders exacerbated by stress, possibly from depression caused by the obvious failure of his revolutionary vision to create the spiritual renewal he had promised. Contemporary medical texts describe symptoms consistent with endocrine disorders that may have affected his judgment and emotional stability, while palace records suggest increasing paranoia about conspiracies by traditional priests and foreign enemies. His death occurred during a lunar eclipse, which his followers interpreted as evidence that Khonsu had summoned his chosen pharaoh to rule eternally in the celestial realm. Though skeptics noted that the timing was purely coincidental, and that the kingdom's problems required earthly rather than cosmic solutions. The restoration began immediately under the guidance of General Ramesses, who assumed pharaonic authority while arranging marriages between Khaemwaset's daughter queens and male relatives who could legitimize the transition back to traditional religious practices. Nefertari married her uncle, creating a degree of genealogical distance from her father husband, while preserving royal bloodlines acceptable to conservative factions. Ankhesenamun and Mritnaith received similar arrangements that dissolved their controversial marriages while ensuring their children, if any survived, would be incorporated into conventional succession patterns rather than representing ongoing challenges to restored orthodoxy. The systematic erasure of Khaemwaset's reign required nearly a decade to complete, as teams of workers traveled throughout Egypt removing his cartouches from temple walls, destroying statues bearing his likeness, and dismantling the architectural innovations that had supported his lunar theology. Khansu-Hotep was gradually abandoned as its population relocated to traditional urban centers, though the process took several years as some inhabitants remained committed to lunar worship. Despite official prohibition, the Great Temple of Khonsu was systematically demolished, with its stone blocks transported to restoration projects at Karnak and other traditional religious sites, creating a form of architectural recycling that physically incorporated the failed revolution into the restored orthodoxy. The official historical records compiled by subsequent dynasties simply omitted Khaemwaset's reign entirely, creating a chronological gap that scholars would not fully understand until modern archaeological methods revealed the physical evidence of his revolutionary experiment. King lists carved during later periods jumped directly from his predecessor to General Ramesses, now ruling as pharaoh, as if the 18 years of lunar worship had never occurred. This historical amnesia proved remarkably effective for over 3 millennia, preserving the illusion that Egyptian civilization had maintained unchanged religious traditions. From its earliest dynasties through the Ptolemaic period, modern DNA analysis of mummies from this period has confirmed the incestuous relationships within Khaemwaset's family while revealing genetic abnormalities consistent with the physical descriptions found in contemporary texts, providing scientific validation for ancient accounts that previous generations of scholars had dismissed as propaganda or metaphor. The genetic evidence also suggests that several children were born to these father-daughter unions, though most appear to have died in infancy or childhood, possibly from congenital disorders related to extreme inbreeding. The few who survived to adulthood were incorporated into conventional marriage arrangements. During the Restoration period, their controversial parentage obscured through adoption procedures and revised genealogies. Archaeological excavations at the site of Khansu-Hotep continue revealing artifacts that illuminate daily life during the lunar revolution, from temple implements designed for nocturnal ceremonies to domestic objects bearing iconography that celebrated cycles of death and renewal rather than eternal stability. The artistic innovations developed during this period influenced subsequent Egyptian culture in subtle ways, introducing naturalistic elements and emotional expressiveness that enriched traditional styles even after the religious revolution itself had been suppressed. Some scholars argue that the psychological insights developed through lunar theology contributed to the emergence of more sophisticated approaches to death and afterlife that characterized later Egyptian religious thought. The story of Khaemwaset III remains largely unknown outside specialist academic circles, despite its profound implications for understanding the relationship between political power, religious authority, and social change in ancient civilizations. His attempt to revolutionize Egyptian religion through lunar worship represents one of history's most ambitious efforts to transform an entire civilization. According to one individual's vision of divine truth, while his family policies illuminate the human cost of treating people as instruments for implementing ideological abstractions, rather than as individuals deserving dignity and protection. Standing today among the restored columns of Karnak, where workers once chiseled away evidence of the lunar revolution, visitors can still detect subtle traces of the drama that unfolded here over 3 millennia ago. Though few recognize the significance of the partially obliterated cartouches, and altered inscriptions that bear witness to 18 years when Egypt worshipped the moon rather than the sun, when divine kingship was redefined through incestuous marriages, and when revolutionary idealism collided with the practical requirements of governing a complex civilization, leaving behind only whispers in the desert wind of what might have been.